Hey everyone, before the segment kicks off, we were having some sound issues at the time of recording, so I've had to cut out the original introduction. So just to give a sort of introduction to the segments, this is our personal top 10 wrestlers of all time. So Carl's going to go through his, and then I will add any others that haven't crossed over with Carl's. We hope you enjoy.
What I'd like to do, Carl, because in all fairness, I think in terms of your historical wrestling knowledge, you're much more well versed in this sort of thing. So, are you happy to run your top 10? And we can go from there with it.
Yeah, definitely. I'll try my best not to go off on any big tangents with this because I do used to be probably a lot more into wrestling back in the day than I am now, which is crazy because I am very much into wrestling now. But I mentioned that I first kind of got into it properly. So I was born in '88. My earliest recollection of wrestling was '91. So from about 3 years old, I was watching it. But for me, like the 1992, 1993 time frame, I think I said earlier, was my kind of favorite time. So it'd be no surprise that the first few on this list are probably from around that era. But it's not in any particular order as such, but just 10 wrestlers who, when I look back across the whole time I've been watching it, kind of were the biggest kind of influence in me, and the ones who, when I draw back on old memories of the ones who kind of bubble up the most as having caused me the most kind of enjoyment on this wrestling journey. So kick off with one of my favorites of all time is Bret the Hitman Hart. So I think, the best technical wrestler that there's ever been is my kind of analysis of him. Maybe even the best wrestler ever, even just outside the technicality of it. I feel like every match he did was different. It never felt like the same stuff. He was never the kind of guy to pull out like the 5 moves of doom, anything like that. He'd always have different finishes, whether it was just something simple like a roll up, or it'd always be different, and he always kind of got the best out of whoever he was in the ring with. But I've always liked him because he worked his way just from a nobody. He then got put into a tag team, kind of made that work for a bit, then had that natural progression into breakout star to the IC title, and then ultimately into the main event. And it's just an excellent kind of level of progression that he showed. I was trying to think back to like favorite moments or favorite times to kind of call out just for this segment, but I struggled, to be fair, because there was so many. I think if I had to pick a kind of the top 3 things that jumped to mind. So there was a match between Bret Hart and Mr. Perfect in around 1991, which I think is probably my favorite match of all time. 2 of my favorites, a full-on proper technical match, full of load of different holds, loads of different suplexes, loads of different submission attempts, things like that. It was just a proper shooter match, and really enjoyed that. All the way through to that was in 1991, so really kind of early on, through to 1997. So like 6 year stretch here, in terms of moments that I'm trying to pick out. But the Bret Hart Stone Cold match in '97. That one was a fantastic one. I'll come on to that a little bit later. But if I had to pick one kind of favorite moment, I would say is WrestleMania 10. So he actually pulled double duty that night. So he was the opening match against his brother Owen, and it was quite a good story that of Owen kind of saying that he was, even though he's younger, he's better than his brother, kind of thing. And that was the opening match, and Owen actually got the win, which I thought was quite funny. But then he was actually in the main event as well, and he goes on to win the title against Yokozuna. So I just think stuff like that is, it's really, he never really cared about just putting himself over. He put his brother over, he put other people over where it was appropriate. So in that time, you had the likes of Hogan and people like that who didn't want to do the job for people. So yeah, I think Bret definitely. I think this segment started out as a Mount Rushmore of wrestling, and I was like, "There's no way I can pick 4 people." So, but if I had to pick 4, then he'd definitely be one of them. I'd say he's definitely one of the best of all time.
Yeah, I mean, he certainly lives up. Am I right in saying his whole catchphrase back in the day was that the best there is, the best there was, the best there ever will be?
Absolutely.
And I think never a truer word spoken. I mean, as I've mentioned a few times, I came into wrestling quite much later on than you. I was probably about 11. It was around the time we met actually as friends before I got into wrestling in a big way. So I sadly never really saw the Bret Hart heyday, as it were. I was totally aware of the name. and the legend, and everyone's heard about the Montreal Screwjob. So you know the guy, but like, I mean, certainly for you, the way you're talking to me there, I mean, it sounds like this is, correct me if I'm wrong, but this is like the first sort of underdog story for you as far as wrestling goes, that you've watched him come up, and he's like the first one you saw do that. If I'm right on saying that.
Yeah, definitely. I think to kind of see his rise from, he was in like WrestleMania 2 in the Battle Royal, as just like one tag team guy, and he didn't really have a big showing. Then, before you know it, a couple of years later, he's like winning his first IC title, and then he goes on to be the guy. So to kind of watch that rise from just some nobody in a Battle Royal to being the WWE champion, it kind of followed him all the way through that. So definitely good to see. Next on the list, as I mentioned him just then previously, was Mr. Perfect. Absolutely love Mr. Perfect. He was my favorite for quite some time. His whole gimmick, he was just brilliant. Like that whole gimmick of it. He used to do these little vignettes of him. Used to like throw a football, like stand and throw it like to the opposite end of the football field, and then go and run down the opposite side and catch his own pass, or like he'd bowl a perfect strike, or bowl a perfect game. Like he basically, like, they did all these little funny, witty things when they first introduced him as like he is perfect, and it was just such a good gimmick. But like as a wrestler as well, I know we spoke about him briefly when we were talking last week around obviously his kid, Curtis Axel, but I just think him and Brett are two of the best wrestlers I think I've ever seen in my whole life. So I used to absolutely love Mr. Perfect, and it's such a random thing that I'll call out, but the thing that always stands out to me when I think about Perfect is he got injured for a bit. I think it was in around end of '91, something like that. He got injured, so he was sidelined because he got such like his charisma was so good. They ended up using him on like TV shows and it's like on commentary and things like that. So they did this angle where Macho Man needed a partner to face Ric Flair and Razor Ramon. Bobby the Brain Heenan, who's like one of the best managers of all time, was kind of saying, "Oh yeah, Perfect, you know your place," kind of thing. You won't speak up, this, that, and the other. And then Perfect basically ended up going up against Ric Flair, he used to manage at one point, and it was just this amazing comeback story of how he got back into the ring. So yeah, I just think he's one of my all-time favorites, Mr. Perfect.
Yeah, I think it's fair to say. I think certainly throughout our childhood, you've always sort of cited him as your favourite wrestler. And again, sadly for me, he's another one who I never really got to see in their heyday, but it's certainly a legend by sort of in the sense of the word, by WWE standards. One of those names that you always hear whenever you get into wrestling. Like certainly one of those names that's even thrown about today, really.
Yeah, definitely. Then third on my list, I've got Roddy Piper. I think he's one of the best talkers ever, Piper. I used to love his promos. He just had this little way about him. He always seemed a little bit crazy, and the stuff he said was always like, you used to have the one extreme, like the Ultimate Warrior, who would just say things that didn't make any sense. But then you had Piper, who would, like, the way he would do his promos, you could tell he was like insane, but they would be so good. I think the best memory I had was when he won the IC title. So I think Bret Hart lost the belt to the Mountie because he had an injury, and Piper kind of took exception to this, so tried to avenge Bret, and ended up winning the Intercontinental title off the Mountie. He never really won many titles, Roddy Piper, which is mad because if you think about it, he was in the very first WrestleMania main event. He was this big star, but he was never a world champion. Considering how good he was. And I always remember him winning that IC title and then the subsequent match with Bret afterwards. And then he ultimately lost that match to Bret, but it was like that show of respect between them afterwards. Even though he was like a little bit of a bad guy, and he was stuff. He had that respect there. So absolutely love Piper.
Yeah, I mean, he's certainly a legend. He's another one that missed out on his heyday. I was fortunate enough that he had a bit of a resurgence in the early 2000s. So he come back doing Piper's Pit, and he was managing, as you might recall at the time, Sean O'Hare.
Oh yeah.
And I totally get what you mean. And whilst I can't I've looked back on some of his stuff in the past, obviously, but he does have an unusual sort of charm about him in terms of his mic skills. So I totally get what you mean. He's probably one of the best talkers, or sadly was one of the best talkers in the business. I totally agree with you there. He's definitely up there on the list.
And then the next one on my list was the Nature Boy, Ric Flair. Again, 1992 was definitely my favorite year in wrestling. But the Royal Rumble, interesting. He bought the WCW title, like he owned it. So when he left WCW and came to the WWF at the time, he entered as like the real world's champion because basically he could bring the belt with him. So it was, I'd never seen anything like it at the time. It was as though this guy had come in who was the best in every other promotion, and now he'd finally arrived in the WWF, and he was gonna like basically come after Hulk Hogan and basically claim his stake and things like that. Unfortunately, we never got that match, which is a shame. But I remember the 1992 Royal Rumble, which is probably my favorite ever pay-per-view. He entered at number 2. And Bobby the Brain Heenan and Gorilla Monsoon were the commentary team at the time, and Heenan was like Ric Flair's manager, and it was just so entertaining to watch, just to see like what Heenan was going through on the commentary when he nearly got eliminated and stuff like that. And obviously he ended up winning that match. It was him, Sid Justice, and Hulk Hogan, I think it was, in the final 3. And then Ric Flair ended up winning it and celebrated it with Mr. Perfect and Bobby the Brain afterwards. But I mean, Flair's a legend. If anyone else is going to be on the Mount Rushmore with Brett, Flair would definitely be up there. He's just one of the all-time greats.
He truly is. I mean, obviously, it was something seldom seen certainly after Vince pulled everything together, WWF and the WWF was born. It was such an unusual thing to have, like you say, have him come along with the title that he owned and play that gimmick. And it is such a shame that it didn't play out as it should have. I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but due to backstage politics and down to Hogan's ego, that didn't work out. But nevertheless, he's had such a big impact on the industry. He was pivotal in putting people over, even in sort of my era of wrestling. He was there with Evolution, putting over Batista and Randy Orton and the like. And he's he was and is a legend. And yeah, totally agree. If anyone should be on that Mount Rushmore, he's certainly one of them.
Well, he even dropped the belt to Brett for Brett's first win, so he definitely did do the job for people. Shame we can't say the same for Hulk Hogan, I suppose, but hence why he's not on my list.
And it's not due to the fact because Hogan was around in my era of wrestling, sadly. So it's not a time thing, but he's not either Hogan, and it's for a very similar reason that his ego was way too over the top, and he was never the guy to put anyone over, and he's still not. He doesn't understand putting new talent over, and he's practically in a wheelchair at this point.
So that means he's main event in WrestleMania soon. Then, anyway. So next on my list, obviously, The Undertaker. So I mean, what else can you say about The Undertaker? I remember watching him debut at Survivor Series. Strangely, with Brother Love as his manager, which obviously they rectified over time and got Paul Bearer to be his manager, which was a much better fit, of course. But he's had one of the best careers ever, hasn't he, Taker? Literally seen it all. He's been the locker room leader through it all as well, through the good times and the bad. I think I think of all these different matches I've seen, his feuds against Kane and things like that. Obviously, one thing that stands out the most, the visual of him throwing Mankind off that Hell in a Cell and then throwing him through the Hell in a Cell and then chokeslamming him on these thumbtacks. That was just a match which you've got Mankind to Mick Foley really is that really made Taker as like a big star in the modern era, because I think prior to that he was starting to become a little bit cheesy and was at risk of being, as part of the WWF at the time, just like it was too gimmicky. So I think that kind of thing really helped keep him kind of the longevity of it, even all the way through to when he got injured and returned at Judgment Day. Remember those creepy little girls that kept coming on the Titantron singing like Ring a Ring of Roses or whatever it was, and then obviously the American Badass gimmick change. It's just a legend, Taker, for everything he's done for the business and the WrestleMania streak. He's got to be up there.
Yeah, totally agree. I mean, as you know, Taker's my favorite wrestler. which is unusual in a way, in the sense of like the Taker I sort of met, if you will, the one I was introduced to when I first got into WWE, was actually the sort of dead man gimmick, as it were, not the original. It was the I think he was using Limp Bizkit at the time, rolling, coming in on his motorbike, and he was that guy. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
But I loved him as a character. He was an absolute badass. You'd hear things about him in the back scene, like you say, he was the locker room leader. He'd hold the wrestlers' court, and no one fucked with Taker. Do you know what I mean? And he just added to that sort of American badass thing. And then obviously I was there for Kane, sort of taking umbrage to what he'd become, and then they had the Buried Alive match, and he'd come back as the proper Undertaker, the Phenom. And it's always been fantastic, and I'm never not happy to see Undertaker. And whilst I moan about part-time, old-time wrestlers, I have nothing but love for Taker coming back and winning the 2-8 trophy.
Yeah. And then when you speak about Taker, you've got to speak about Kane. So I think his arrival was just one of the best things I've ever seen. It was built up for so long. I remember watching it. I was watching it like every week at this point, I think, at this time. And Paul Bearer was doing a fantastic job of coming out, and we found out Undertaker had a brother, and I was like, fucking hell, like, what are they going to do? It's going to be something really corny. Like, there's no way anyone can come out and be, anything like the Undertaker. You think about it, it could have gone so horribly wrong, but then it just works so well. Like, all of a sudden in this Hell in a Cell match, Kane just turns up. We see him for the first time, got this like fucking kick-ass mask on, this like mad like outfit. You're just like, who the fuck is this guy? Rips the door off the Hell in a Cell, and then like steps in. He's bigger than the Undertaker. Like, honestly, like, it was so menacing. I remember watching it live, just going, oh my god. I proper marked out, like, because I was a big Taker fan anyway, but then seeing this guy all of a sudden just became like my instant favorite. And I think even towards like, maybe not towards the end of his career with all the corporate Kane and stuff like that, I feel like he went a bit the Big Show route, really, where he kind of just stayed there a bit too long and ended up suffering. But probably just prior to that, where he was still in the mask and stuff, but he kind of went a bit more comedic as well. I remember him doing stuff like the Kane Rooney with Booker T, and there's a promo which I'll never forget as well. I think it was just after WrestleMania 18, so I think The Rock and Hogan had their kind of WrestleMania match, and Hogan became a good guy at the end of it, and he got rejected by the NWO, so they had like a triple threat, and it was Hogan and Rock and Kane. And he had this backstage segment, and obviously everything The Rock's in is hilarious. But it was like he said to take it to Kane. He was like, "Are you ready?" And he was like, "Yeah, I'm ready. Are you ready?" And The Rock went to answer, and he was like, "It doesn't matter if you're ready." And he cut The Rock off with his own material and stuff. And then he started doing Hulk Hogan stuff, and it's funny to see that he could be so comedic as well towards like the end of his character.
If you don't mind me saying, it was a night. I think another good example of his comedic ability was in Team Hell No.
Yeah.
They had some really good banter off each other. I distinctly remember when they were going to group therapy together, and they were asking about his anger issues, and he sort of comedically went through all the stupid storylines they had about like the Katie Vick thing and all that. And the rest of the room was just mortified, and it just played so well. And he's got actually some really good comic timing, Kane.
Yeah, it's mad, really. Like, but I had to put him on just because I think back, and he was definitely my favorite wrestler for a good 2-3 years at one point. So he's definitely definitely one of my favorites.
Yeah, I totally.
And then Triple H. So I was also a big Triple H mark. I think the prime Triple H years for me was like 99, 2000. It was when he was still in DX, I think, at the time, but he was like when he was trying to make it on his own and be that main event star, kind of just before he became the Game, but when his transition to that. Like, it was when just around the time he drugged Steph and married her in Vegas, and then it was like the McMahon Helmsley era and stuff like that. But I just think Triple H is just a legend for everything he's done. Even now, like what he's given back to the business and stuff. But I'll never forget how white hot he was after he came back from injury, because he ruptured his quad. And I think he came back. It was like 2002.
Yeah,
and that
actually,
that big return that he did, and like the way the crowd popped and everything for it, and then he obviously went on to win the Undisputed Championship against, I think it was Jericho at that year's WrestleMania. So it was just such a good like drawn out story and redemption arc. But yeah, Triple H is just fucking brilliant.
And you know what, it says a lot, really, or hopefully it says a lot, that even I remember that comeback, and I probably wasn't as invested as you because I'd not long got into wrestling. But even I was more when he come back, and obviously he rocked up with his denim jacket, as it were, and obviously done his typical entrance, which again was all unfamiliar to me. But he come across as such a badass, and like you say, he just run sort of roughshod over Jericho, who was the undisputed champion at the time, and yeah, it was put so well, and I wasn't even there for him being injured in the first place, but even I was so on board with that.
Yeah, it's a fucking legend. But he's done obviously all the evolution and the game and all these, the King of Kings. Like it's just been brilliant over the years. Absolute legend.
Pivot to NXT as well, and you know you can't NXT when it was awesome.
Yeah.
So you know,
and then I've got Stone Cold. I mean, you can't overlook Stone Cold. I don't think we'd have, you know, wrestling if it wasn't for Stone Cold, because WWF was on its ass. You know, WCW would have imploded regardless anyway. But at a time when the WWF was just full of corny gimmicks and was really losing viewers, that Stone Cold character, he just basically everyone talks about Hogan and wrestling wouldn't be what it was without Hogan and WrestleMania and this kind of thing, but fucking like wrestling wouldn't be what it was without Stone Cold. He basically out of nothing just made the WWF relevant again and ended up like winning that ratings battle. But everything he did was like must see TV, whether it was like beating up Vince McMahon in a hospital bed with a bedpan dressed as a doctor, or stealing a beer truck and hosing people down. He was just must see TV for a good like couple of years at that point, and basically rescued WWF. And even later on in his the later days, I remember the comedic stuff he did with Kurt Angle, like the Kumbayas and stuff with the little tiny cowboy hat. And like obviously the match he had with Booker T in a supermarket. He's just random stupid shit like that. Like he was just always entertaining. And obviously he had those matches with The Rock at WrestleMania, which were just fantastic.
Yeah, I mean, even when you look back at like what sort of, I don't say it's what made him famous. I think he was going to become like a big name regardless. But that key sort of moment, the Austin 316 thing was born. Even it's all iconic stuff, and he's such a big name. Again, he's another one that even if you're not a wrestling fan, you know Stone Cold Steve Austin.
Yeah, definitely. He was just he was the biggest thing for a good period of time. He was an absolute legend. And then obviously his counterpart also vying for the number one spot at that time was The Rock. I still maintain The Rock is probably the most charismatic like wrestler ever. Like behind a mic, I don't think there's ever been or will probably ever be someone who's just so funny and charismatic behind that mic. Like every time you got hold of it, the fans were just on the edge of the seat. It was dead silent. You knew it was going to be, you knew you're going to laugh your ass off. You knew someone was going to get absolutely destroyed. And he just absolutely owned it. And, he never had it easy to begin with. He had terrible gimmicks with Rocky Maivia and Part of the Nation. And then to see him just make his own thing and turn it into what it was, he was just crazy to think what a big star he was in WWE. I think just to, knowing what we know now, he's the biggest movie star in the world. Like he's built like a brick shithouse now. Like, you look back at old Rock matches and stuff, and he just looks like pudgy and like, he's not even really that big. So like, imagine how big he was. Imagine if he had the fucking physique that he's got now. Crazy way to think about, but I loved all his stuff, like his feud with Triple H, even the stuff with the Big Show after the Royal Rumble, where they had that thing who was eliminated first, and he just used to take the piss out of him every time. He'd be like, "Oh, look, it's Big Show," and he'd like put his hand up and down and do like the choke slam thing. It's just brilliant. And obviously the WrestleMania 18 match with Hogan, that was like a classic. And even the recent stuff, like the once in a lifetime that ended up twice in a lifetime with Cena, he's had some of the best moments. I think he's just absolutely quality.
No, I couldn't agree more. A lot of people probably know more movie star, but no, he was fantastic. He was always great on the mic. Like you say, he's probably the biggest personality in wrestling, really. Yeah, he's yeah. I don't think I think it's fair to say he's one of a kind, really. There's not been anyone like him. I don't think there will be.
No, definitely not. And then my final one was Chris Jericho. So I think Jericho's just been fantastic for years, and it's crazy really when you look back even to WCW times. Like, I was never a massive WCW fan, but I'd always like flip over and see what was going on. And I remember he would always stand out, him and Eddie and Ray and fucking like their kind of cruiserweight division would really stand out. And Jericho, even just for he was the one who was the most vocal on the mic at the time in that division. So I always sort of like liked him and knew him. Then when he kind of turned up with the whole Y2J thing and the countdown to Millennium, you know, his debut was with The Rock, so obviously he started off hot. And then he was, you know, IC title. I've always been a massive fan of the Intercontinental title. I've always seen it as like the real workhorse's belt. Like, if you think back in the day, the guys who had the main title was the likes of Hogan and Sid Vicious and like just the Ultimate Warrior, the people who didn't really put on great matches but were just big. But then you had like people who were fighting for the IC title, like Brett and, you know, Shawn, Perfect, all these guys who were like the real wrestlers, like Steamboat, Macho Man. So
Yeah.
I've always been a massive IC title fan. I feel like it lost its way, but I think once Jericho got into that division, like the matches he put on with Benoit and Kurt Angle, he even had IC title matches with China and made them entertaining and fun. Do you know what I mean? He really did such great stuff there, and ultimately became the undisputed champ, which I think no one expected to beat Stone Cold and The Rock on the same night. You know, it's what a thing to have on your resume, that. And then little did we know that was just him getting started. You know, he came back, you know, went away, became a rock star, came back with like the Save Us promo, the light up jacket. He just keeps reinventing himself, like the list. That Festival of Friendship stuff with Kevin Owens is like some of the best stuff I've seen in ages. Continued to reinvent himself in Japan, like the Painmaker, for God's sake, all the way through to now as Le Champion in AEW. Like that promo, that thing in the lead up to the Cody match where he replicated the Cody Rhodes promo was just hilarious. I don't think I've laughed at something in wrestling that much in so long, and I just think he's definitely on the top of the wrestling world right now, and he's been on the cusp of it for so long, really, when you think about it. And it's like he's definitely the guy now. I look around at the rest of the wrestling landscape, and there's no one there who you would go, okay, he's the guy. Like, Jericho is the guy. He is the Rock or the Stone Cold of this generation, I would say.
No, I totally agree. I mean, he's an absolute legend, and I'll be honest, every time you see him, it's a great time. Like, every time he's made his return to WWE, which I think has been about 3 or 4 times in total, you're always happier when he's there. Do you know what I mean? Like you say, even the modern day WWE stuff that he did with the list or the Festival of Friendship, and it was all fantastic stuff to watch. He can pretty much sell any gimmick, and I don't know why I feel the need to mention it, but it was awesome to see. I can't remember what show it was done on, but on one of his AEW entrances, he actually had an entrance where they went through every one of his gimmicks. Do you remember seeing this?
Yeah, was it on the All Out pay-per-view or something?
And it was such that, to me, that resonated with me so much, because you go, fucking hell, yeah, he's such a chameleon. He transformed himself so much. But they went through the original, you know, the Sabres with the light up jacket, the Painmaker. They sort of briefly went through it all in just one entrance, and you're like, fucking hell, yeah, he's an absolute legend. He knows how to move with the times and move with the product, and he is funny as fuck. Like, honestly, anyone who's listening, if you've not seen that video that he did in response to Cody, watch it. It's fantastic. I was an absolute stitch. Even pokes fun at the fact that he is getting up there in age, because that's one bit that really creases me, Carl. Do you remember that, where they were saying like he's the youngest AEW ever?
Yeah.
Like, well, technically that's true. And even that, he's hysterical. He's fantastic, and he's a fantastic wrestler as well. Considering his age as well, he can still go in the ring. And I believe, by all accounts, in real life, he's a tough son of a bitch as well.
Well, he apparently had a fight with Goldberg and he beat him. So, and this isn't Oldberg. This is when Goldberg was somewhat more in his prime. So,
Well, I heard a similar thing. Not that he had a fight with him, but I heard a similar thing that when Brock and Randy had their match, and he elbowed him and drew blood, and no one realized it was a shoot. Jericho was ready to have Brock, by all accounts. The situation was calmed down before that kicked off, but Jericho didn't realize that sort of Randy was in on it and it was a shoot. He just thought Brock was being careless, and he was ready to have words, you know. And there's just no fear in him. And to be fair, by all accounts, he doesn't need to have any fear. He's a tough guy.
Defo. So I think it was very difficult, but I think that I'm happy with my 10.
I like it. What I'll do then, I'm not going to sort of go over ones that we've clashed on. So I'll mention, as far as my list goes, and it'll be no surprise to you, of your initial ones, many of them aren't on my list not because they're not legends, they totally are, but just because they were sort of out of my era. So when you get the likes of Bret Hart or Mr. Perfect or Ric Flair, you're not going to see them on my list, sadly. But that's not because they don't deserve to be. So what I'd like to mention before I go into, I'm only going to mention the ones that we haven't already talked about. So what I will mention briefly is that obviously Undertaker being my favorite wrestler, definitely on my list. Stone Cold, The Rock, and Jericho, all definitely on my list. And again, basically for the reasons we discussed. And lastly, Kane. Where I differ, and one that I want to mention, the first one I'll mention that differs is Sting. And this is kind of a personal thing, really, because Sting is essentially the first wrestler I sort of got into or knew, because I actually started sort of dabbling slightly in WCW around the time of obviously the NWO stuff and being their main rival, and then moving into obviously the whole Wolfpack thing, and obviously he was going through. He'd obviously watched The Crow and thought it was good, so he sort of changed his stuff and he just looked badass. A young kid watching it and going, God, he's badass, and he's fighting this sort of unstoppable group and stuff, and it was brilliant to see. And he is a legend, to be fair. He's another one he's been in the industry forever. He's changed his gimmick so many times, and I just wanted to give a mention on the list because, really speaking, I would even argue that it's sort of what got me into wrestling, really.
I think I was saying to you before, I think it's mad that I never really even knew that. I was always a WWF guy. I was never really a WCW guy. But when the NWO stuff was happening, I did find myself kind of moving across and like watching it because it was more entertaining for a certain period of time. And I do remember Sting, and just kind of because I knew him back when he was like, beach Sting, like blonde hair, teaming with like Lex Luger kind of thing, like from way back in the day. And I remember just seeing him and go, fucking hell, that's Sting. Because at the time I never kind of pictured him as this kind of main event kind of guy. I just thought he was like a tag team dude. But it was mad to see what he became, and I think it was nice to finally see him wind up in WWE eventually, even if it was just to take a loss to Triple H, do you know what I mean? But it's just a shame that we never did get to see that Sting and Undertaker match.
Yeah. Unfortunately, they had bigger plans, and it didn't work out due to Sting's conditioning and his injuries. But it would have been fantastic to see. For me, bearing in mind Sting's like the earliest memory, I suppose, and Undertaker's my favorite wrestler. So for me, that match would have just been fucking perfect,
Definitely.
And it's such a shame, but we can only dream. I wanted to give him a mention, and you could argue for some people he might not be a top 10 guy, but certainly one I needed to mention for that reason. Then I'm trying to sort of be a bit like fair on my next one on my list, which is CM Punk.
Mm-hmm.
And in all fairness, it's kind of an odd way of putting it because it's my top 10. But I'm putting him in there for the impact he had on an era that I thought was kind of dull. I was certainly dipping in and out of WWE at that point. And you could argue it was because obviously we'd grown up, we were in college, and it just wasn't that product anymore. But that being said, I watch it now and I'm a fanboy now. So it's not an age thing. I think WWE was just going for a spell where they had no competition and they just become a bit, naff, mild, rubbish, whatever you want to call them. And CM Punk was almost a bit of a shining light amongst that. Certainly from the moment he done that shoot, which some argue there was a lot of truth in that and a lot of unscripted elements in that, and I'm sure there was. But the Summer of Punk and sort of his contribution to the wrestling industry, I don't think goes unnoticed, especially in the time it was needed. So I wanted to throw him on the list as well.
I think it's a shame it was only for the summer, really, because I remember watching that promo, and it did give me chills. It was what we absolutely needed at that time. It was around the time of the anonymous Raw GM. You had John Laurinaitis in there for some reason. It was just the product was awful, and then when Punk comes out there and just cuts this promo, and it's just like it felt almost like a bit like the Attitude Era again, almost. And he was red hot as well during that time. It was like I think it was Money in the Bank, wasn't it? Him and Cena, and you didn't know whether he was gonna re-sign his contract and all that kind of stuff, and it just created so much intrigue at a time when it was boring as fuck, like you say. So I think he definitely rescued like a lot of fans during that time, kind of kept them with the product.
Yeah, I totally agree. And he sadly he didn't keep me with the product, but he certainly made me look at the stuff he was doing, and it probably was a contributing factor to what got me back into it. But I did get back into it as he was sort of plateauing, and then spat his dummy out and never came back. So there you go. But I think on that basis, he deserved a mention. So he's on my list. No particular order to it, so he's not particularly highly ranked on that list, but he's there. And the reason I mentioned no particular order is because I would argue that the next person I've got on my list, Kurt Angle, it should be and is higher up on that list in terms of ranking. I wanted to put Kurt in there because as far as the people we've mentioned so far, the likes of The Rock, Stone Cold, Jericho, he is the other name in that era. He's always played a good part. He's another one who he's a fantastic wrestler. He's obviously Olympic level wrestling when it comes to the your proper wrestling, your Greco-Roman or whatever. And he's I mean, like when you look at the comedic element, similar to like with Kane, like he was a funny guy as well. Like he emulated the Stone Cold beer truck thing with the milk truck. He had a rap battle with John Cena, which was fantastic. He done the like you say, when Stone Cold was doing his sort of friendly guitar playing guy, he was there with his little cowboy hat, following suits and stuff, and it was all just played so well. He done a hair versus hair match with Edge, which shouldn't have worked. It should have been a bad match, should have been a bad storyline, but it worked so well. Because he played it so comedically afterwards, wearing that stupid helmet, if you might recall, with the fake wig underneath. All in all, he seemed to, in most of his career, he would play to someone else. Do you know what I mean? So like Stone Cold or The Rock was the bigger guy in it, and the memorable guy in it. But Kurt was there. Kurt was always there, and he was a ledge. And there's a reason, like the "You Suck" chant slowly turned into an endearing thing. People said it out of love instead of out of the gimmick it originally came from.
Yeah.
And absolute legend. The only bad thing I recall from his career, and I'm sure there is more to it, was the poorly executed Jason Jordan son storyline.
Yeah.
But beyond that, he's an absolute legend, and I think well deserves a spot on the list.
I think he was just on the cusp of mine. I think the contributions he's kind of made, even like I think back to that match he had with Shane McMahon at King of the Ring, the trying to throw him through that glass, and you know what I mean, like the risks he took and things like that as well. Like considering he was a former Olympic wrestler and he just picked this up, and then you'd think he just wouldn't have any charisma to go with it, but to be the character that he was and how funny he was and all the things he's been involved in, he was just brilliant. I used to love him when he was there on SmackDown and the stuff he was doing. So even the stuff with Triple H and Stephanie and things like that, and Stone Cold. So yeah, I think that's a great pick.
You know what I think goes a little bit unsung as well was when Brock was in his heyday and he was coming up, and one of Brock's biggest rivalries was his battle with Kurt Angle, and then So the next one for me, and I'll put him next because it's similar reasoning, is Mick Foley or Mankind or what was his other one?
You'd love Cactus Jack.
I want to mention him because again, he's never been a big star in his own right, with all due respect to him, but he's always been a key player in a lot of other people's big moments, such as, and he's been mentioned by you, but not in the list sense, but like such as Taker putting him through the ring or throwing him off the ring, He will put his body through such punishment just for the sake of our entertainment, and is an absolute legend for that. And yeah, I mean, there's not much more I can say about him other than the fact that just the amount of punishment he was willing to give himself just to sell the product, it amazes me, and I think he's well deserving of a spot on the list.
I think I'm just trying to look through my list now. I think the amount he did for some of the people on my list to make them the stars that they became. Do you know what I mean? So Undertaker, as you said, then with Hell in a Cell, the stuff he did with Kane and like the boiler room matches and things like that. The feuds he had with Triple H, like as ridiculous as it was, where I still never forget where him and Mankind were feuding, and he was like, "You're not gonna fight Mankind, you're gonna fight." He took his mask off and was like, "Cactus Jack," and did look on Triple H's face like he's just seen a ghost. And it's like, all he's done is take his mask off. He's still the same guy, but it was like funny. Even like the matches he had with Stone Cold and like the Rock and Sock connection, like he's literally been ingrained in so many of my choices, and I just think he was a pivotal part of all of their success, I would say.
Yeah, no, I totally agree, and I think that's why he deserved the mention, because like even without mentioning him, when you were telling about your ones, he was coming up in those stories, and I think that's a lot about him. You know,
yeah, definitely.
He's never been the main event guy, all due respect, in the sense of like title holder, the name of the company, the face of the company. He's never been that guy, but he's always been a pivotal part in everyone's stories. Really, it's certainly in that. And the last one for me, and I was a bit up and down on this, but I think, and I've mentioned it earlier, and it might be because of the current product, but I've put Matt Hardy in there, and I think that's because of not so much everything he's done in WWE, and I've mentioned that he's been through so many gimmick changes. I find him to be a very creative guy, and he is a legend in his own right. But even the stuff like he was doing for TNA, and the sort of, whether you love it or hate it, the different thing he was putting into wrestling, with this whole broken gimmick and the Hardy compound and Vanguard one and all this sort of stuff. It was a bit Marmite, you either loved it or hated it, but at the same time, it was something that no one else was doing, and it was, to me, it's a significant contribute to the product. But even when you look back at his history with WWE, some of the best work he did, ironically, was with Edge over the whole Lita thing. And admittedly, that was because they were almost on the cusp of actually physically fighting. But some of the best matches they put on together. And again, he's a legend who probably doesn't go as noticed as some, but I thought deserved a bit of a shout on this list.
Yeah, definitely. I think we said, like, we touched on it briefly before, but I think Jeff always got all the plaudits and was always the standout. And really, if you actually look at it, if you look at Matt Hardy in terms of reinvention, did that so much more than Jeff. Jeff's always just been Jeff Hardy, whereas Matt Hardy had like the version 1, like Mattitude era. He had the broken Matt Hardy, and the Hardy Boys Hardy, the Redemption Hardy, with the Edge and Lita storyline. Like he's done so much more from a character standpoint, and I think you said as well about around him changing the face of wrestling. Like I remember, TNA was dead, and then all of a sudden Matt Hardy comes up with this Hardy compound broken gimmick, and it got so many eyes on it, like on a product that people didn't even watch, and they were watching it just for him. So I think he definitely is, brought a lot to the business, and I hope it continues, and hopefully in AEW, so we can see it go further.
Oh yeah, definitely. But I mean, as I said, I briefly went through the ones that were roughly the same, but that's pretty much my list, barring obviously the ones we've already talked about. So I think those sorts of, well, not 20 or so, but you know what I mean. Those people, I think, certainly in my opinion, are probably the most significant names there, and I think it'd be tough to dispute any of that, really.
Yeah, definitely. I think there's some of them like Mick Foley and Kurt Angle and stuff, which absolutely, like, it's so hard when you're trying to pick a list. I think we started off saying we're going to pick 4, and then it was 5, and then it was 10, and there's still people that I'm kicking myself that I couldn't put on that list. So I think it's a testament to all the great people that have come before us, and hopefully we'll start to see more and more people from this era and the future eras that we could be talking about in future podcasts as our top 10 from the last few years who have become major stars.
I think it'd be a fantastic one going forward, because what I found interesting about this list is the crossover in era. Like a lot of the stuff you're listing from the early 90s before I was into it, obviously I can't appreciate the same way. And you can see how it sort of carries over, that we sort of meet around Stone Cold and The Rock. You know what I mean? I find that interesting when it comes to making these top tens, how era specifically can be sometimes. And I like to think that will always carry forward. Like, we will be able to do a top 10 for the modern product. And I'm sure we will at some point. But yeah, it looks hopeful when you look at some of the legends in the business still, and some of the people coming up now.
Definitely.
And I think that's the end of our segment. Yeah.
Yeah, I think we're done.
Awesome. Right, guys. So I hope you've all enjoyed.